I find the idea that, for example, to be in a committed relationship with someone, like romantically, a family member, a friend, whatever, one way to sustain that is to realize that the more that you know someone, not the more you know them, the less you know them, but you'll never know them exhaustively, and to sort of surrender to that and to use every instance of being with them to learn more about them and to sort of like give them space to change and not sort of like let your imago or your idea of them like overtake them. I think that's obviously a beautiful and important idea. And I'm curious if I can use photography to apply that to like inanimate things or things that we consider inanimate because we don't pay enough attention to them. I think that the more we pay attention to small things, the more we see that the world is complicated, that what we typically consider inanimate actually has a sort of life of its own. And that, if we give it our attention, we'll sort of garner more respect for things like, I could say nature with a capital N, but individual things in nature, small objects, whether that's like a puddle or the quality of light at dusk and how every night, it has its own sort of characteristic. It's never the same each time. I'm curious if I can use photography to sort of like apply that to the.
Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you. And thanks for having me here. I'm excited to talk to you.
I'm excited too. I've been looking a lot at your work, and I've been very excited to finally get you into our show. And so for those who do not know you, can you go ahead and take some time to introduce yourself?
Well, my name is Michael, as you already said, but I'm a photographer from the Midwestern United States, from the Detroit area. I went to school, to college initially in Detroit as well. So I spent a good amount of my life in the Midwest, sort of in Michigan, around the Great Lakes, sort of finding ways to center my life around photography. Grew to be very important to me. Recently, I graduated from Syracuse University with an MFA in art photo. And currently I live in southeastern Vermont, where I recently took a job as the program director of a Insight Photography Project, which is a little photo nonprofit education organization. It's really wonderful. But I'm a photographer by training, sort of by discipline, by vocation, I guess. It's sort of been the thing that I've centered my life around for, I guess, since I was a teenager. Yeah.
So did you I read an interview that you did a year ago with Urbanautica, and it said something about you said something about you knew really early on that you were going to be in the arts. How did you know? Is it just something that you were just drawn to?
I was definitely drawn to it. It didn't really feel like much of a choice. I know that's sort of, I hate to sort of delve into the,
I'm
finding
exactly what you
cliches, or to origins like that. But I don't know. I struggled in high school. I struggled in school before I decided to go to art school. And so basically I was very invested in my education, wasn't doing very well in the school system, the United States school system. Went to Catholic school, which was a bit strict for me, I guess. And so it was pretty apparent that if I wanted to continue my education in a meaningful way, that I had to work on going to art school. And, on top of that, I just spent an inordinate amount of time, like as an adolescent into adulthood, photographing and finding ways to use photography to navigate my environment in unconventional ways, to sort of, as an excuse to go out and to see things and to study things, whether they be novel or whether they be sort of like socially meaningful to me. It was, photography in high school and after was a way for me to sort of refocus and reorient my world around a practice that actually contributed a significant amount of meaning to my surroundings growing up that I thought were pretty drab. Like, the suburbs. So a lot of it actually did, I should say, not to play that down, finding a way to actually make my surroundings interesting played a large part in why I think I ended up with photography.
Wow. I know some people know immediately, some people don't. And I thought that was quite interesting. You knew you were going to be in the arts. Some people are just I was just shooting just for fun. And I had no idea that this was going to turn into what it is today. And so I thought that was quite interesting. Was school a big part of forming what you do today? Was finding art school kind of like the missing link? You said you had a kind of a tough time in early school.
Honestly, yes. I think art school was art school's where I sort of figured out what I was actually good at in a community sense. In art school,
sure.
I was lucky enough to have a pretty good community of peers, good community of faculty in College for Creative Studies, my art school in Detroit that I went to. And so, that was meaningful to me to, I think actually maybe to an extraordinary degree, being able to be around a bunch of like-minded people asking similar questions or asking completely different questions, but all being committed to this thing, to art. And I guess I've kind of finally felt like I was contributing to something, and that I was, I was being seen for being good at something when I got to that point. On top of that, I don't know, I felt like a lot of the questions that I encountered in art school, I don't know, they struck me as extremely important to sort of continue to delve into after school. I had some pretty good faculty who, I don't know, understood that what I was trying to do wasn't just take pictures of the world. It was, photography as a way to ask questions, or almost a way to do visual philosophy, I guess.
Yeah.
At that point, the fact that I was able to sort of commit myself to saying something in a structure that was largely up to me, which is, my art practice and what constitutes my art practice. Finding that in art school was really important to me, if that makes sense.
No, it does completely. It really does. It's I know when I did business school first, and I didn't last. And then it took me years before I finally went to an art program, and then I was like, oh, I think I'm in the right place. And so I was curious if that was kind of the same feeling you had, and it sounds like it was. I'm curious. Go ahead.
No, it's just agreeing with you mostly. It's kind of a wonderful thing. It's a big privilege to get to go to art school, especially
of course,
a 4-year art college where just everybody's studying art as opposed to a university setting. It was a great experience.
Sure. I think you were talking about you were talking about just recently about the kind of questions that you were asking, and I found that in your work you kind of you land on climate and place in that sense, and I was curious what draws you to that.
It's a good question. It's something I think I've asked myself a fair amount. I didn't grow up in a conventionally beautiful place. In fact, I was often distraught asking myself questions like, how am I supposed to make the photographs I want to make if I'm sort of so grounded in this setting that I feel like I need to, it's another cliche, but I felt like I needed to leave and go to someplace more sort of that I felt more connected to. I did spend a lot of time growing up going to Lake Huron in Michigan, which is the east shore of the state. It's really beautiful. The lake is gorgeous. It's sort of like a blue collar vacation town, I guess, where I would go to, where the economy largely is centered around tourism, but at the same time, there's no enormous sort of spectacular natural sites. There's no large rock formations. There's no big sweeping vistas or anything. It's woods and the lake. And something about, getting to visit there once a year, or going camping with my family when I was a kid, and being in the settings where, my movement through space wasn't so predetermined like it was in the suburbs. You have to follow the grid and whatever design the suburbs have taken. That felt quite meaningful to me, along with the fact that in northern Michigan, where I'm talking about, the line of sight is pretty short unless you're looking out onto the lake. Like, it's trees or it's buildings, it's largely trees, right? So you're not like looking out into large vistas. And I think I learned to look up close at things and to sort of like look at what's directly around me. And I guess it also fostered a sort of respect for natural or for open settings that aren't, that aren't extraordinarily picturesque or like spectacularly beautiful, but that are beautiful in more subtle ways that require you to sort of spend time with them. Besides that, I don't know. I've been drawn to it quite a lot. After college, I moved to Marquette, Michigan on Lake Superior, which is something that I had sort of like deeply wanted to do. And there's a lot of reasons that I did it, but I sort of took it as an opportunity to commit myself to making a body of work that I could only make, A, while I was like that young, B, where I didn't really have any like large financial or life responsibilities. And so I worked part-time jobs. Like, I worked in a library, I worked on like a national park tour boat. And the whole time I sort of like dedicated all of my time and money to making a body of work called Eyes Make the Horizon. And I kind of began to really find my language there in terms of the questions that I would ask later in my practice.
Do you, I'm just curious now, it's like, I grew up in the suburbs too. And so you're exactly right. It becomes very repetitive very, very quickly. And so like, do you have any photos of that? Of course, it's probably not in the archives. Are you going to break any of those back out one day?
Probably one day. I mean, like
one day.
A lot of the pictures that I have of the suburbs are, they're on sort of like a Flickr account right now that I don't even know the password to. I put it on private like a few years ago. There are these pictures of like me and like my high school girlfriend and my friends and like all these places in Metro Detroit at night. And I don't know. I kind of deeply want to look back on them, and part of me wants to
just leave it behind. Yeah.
Maybe I should have prepped some for today. It would have been interesting.
Oh, you didn't know I was going to ask. Well, it's kind of based on some of you said you've been exploring a camera for a long time, and considering where you came from, Detroit, you might actually have a kind of a large experimental body of work. I'm always curious what those look like. Kind of see where someone goes. And when you look at your work, you can tell you've gone through an evolution. And I kind of want to ask you a little bit about that. You kind of went from, these landscapes into more abstract pieces and this disappearing kind of image. And I kind of want to ask you what kind of facilitated the evolution and why you go in that direction now.
Yeah,
I like it.
It's largely a direction I've gone sort of since grad school. So I finished grad school in 2022. And sort of upon going, I don't know, as I was saying, when I moved to northern Michigan and sort of committed myself to making sort of, I guess, experimental landscape work, if I can take a liberty and call it that, I was sort of aware that I couldn't keep up the amount that I was traveling to photograph. Like, it was all in like the general area in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, mostly along the shore of Lake Superior, but it's still, a lot of time, and you have to have a good car for it, all of these things. And upon going to grad school, I sort of wanted to retool my practice in a way where I wasn't so reliant, A, on my car, and B, I don't know, I was starting to find it meaningful and find other artists' practices artists who sort of practice in their own like personal space, essentially, without having to go out into the world. I started to find that particularly meaningful, especially if you can, you can use your immediate surroundings, whatever is close to you, to say something broader, to say something that isn't just concerned with, my immediate surroundings. So I started to find that particularly meaningful. There's a whole tradition of artists that sort of talk about turning their back to the world, like Agnes Martin, but people see her paintings and it's, people talk about being confronted with like pretty extreme or, being emotionally moved to pretty great degrees. I know I have been by her work, and I've, even maybe like some of Maggie Nelson's writing, like The Argonauts, where she is writing about her immediate life and sort of the banalities of her life and reflecting on large theoretical questions. I started finding things like that really, really interesting. Wanted to sort of get into that territory. Additionally, I started finding questions to do with time to be extremely interesting, as well as a sort of, I want to take like the subtractive nature of photography, right? The fact that you take a camera and you frame something, it's sort of, I consider it subtractive in a way, right? As opposed to a painting being a canvas. I kind of wanted to see how far I could take that. And as opposed to simply using the camera to sort of frame a particular thing, to see if I could actually, in my process of making pictures, also winnow the world down as much as I could, and see what was left. And of course, I don't think there's that many things that we can solidly say are facts. I think something that we can, though, is that change and time are sort of a constant thing, and they're, time is a fact. We're all going to die. And I guess I started becoming interested in sort of trying to talk about that photographically as maybe as broad as that is, right? But yeah. I guess novel ways to record time and to talk about repetition and to talk about a lot of sort of more abstract ideas and terms and things that I started becoming invested in. Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious, a lot of times in a development of artistic practice or what have you, you have someone that come into your world that's really significant for you. Do you have anybody like that?
I guess my faculty in grad school also had a pretty large effect on me. How can they not?
Yeah.
But, I don't know. My friendships and the nature of sort of vulnerability that came with them in grad school was something that really sort of changed me. And that's
there's something about there's something about that experience in grad school that does that. It's like you get put in with a cohort and you get to really know each other's work, and they always ask the best questions. So I was, I'm always curious about those pivoting moments. I'm always curious about those people that come in to your life that kind of give you, what did they give you? That you feel like, is there something specific? You're just like, this is it connected.
Questions to do with vulnerability and emotional vulnerability definitely played a large part in it. I think especially before grad school, my work was largely concerned with the sort of like blurred line between self and place, and the fact that I feel personally committed to the idea that you cannot draw strict boundaries between yourself and your surroundings, a given setting, the people who influence you, like the borders of the self are porous. And I think I was sort of trying to approach that through landscape and through things that didn't necessarily, like maybe they're emotionally evocative without me sort of actually having to pour my personal emotions into them in an obvious way. That might still be true of my work if I'm not joking myself, but at the same time, the way that a lot of the friends that I made in grad school approach personal questions in their work, and from those personal questions draw, they draw conclusions, or they say something that can apply to me whose experience is other than theirs. Like my friend Ellery makes a lot of work about grief. My friend Linda has been doing a sort of study of her parents for years and her relationship to her parents. And these sort of like very close, like subtle, and sometimes, obviously the nature of making work about grief is overwhelming, if not like unsayable. And so the fact that becoming close to someone who's actually working through that and finding ways to make the unsayable sayable really ended up having a large effect on me.
Yeah. Wow. That's wonderful. I think the people around us, they can definitely get us to look a little deeper. And that's how you know you have a good group, is when they go beyond the surface and they touch you in that way. My next question has to do with what artists are out there that had an influence on you. I know when I've read a previous interview that you did before, you were talking about get to know artists, understand kind of different work. Which ones were influential for you?
It's a good question. It's always one of those questions I weirdly like. I feel like I have a blank slate whenever I'm asked, and whenever I'm not asked, I have this whole sort of people who are affecting me. Ronnie,
you're like
big one.
There you go.
Yeah. Ronnie Horn's a big one for me. I think her work is amazing. Agnes Martin is another one, and the photographer Jem Southam has had a pretty big effect on my work. Who else? The painter, actually. This is like somebody whose influence has both been sort of like subtle, but I think consistent. Sylvia Plymack Mangold, who's, I haven't seen her work that much in the world, but I saw one of her paintings at the Detroit Institute of Arts when I was younger, and it stuck with me in an intense way. I think there are probably more painters than photographers, honestly, that have influenced me.
I'm starting to see that
as well
in
as
your work. Yeah, I see that. It's you've got this painterly like approach now. You've evolved a lot, and I'm quite a fan. And so I thought I was kind of curious. What was it about these artists? Could you give me what is it about them that influenced you? You brought up Agnes a few times.
Mm-hmm. I guess it's the thing I'm still trying to figure out also. I should also like Steve Reich, the musician, for example, has also been like a huge influence on me. And maybe like tying him in there sort of, it paints a fuller picture in the sense that I think a lot of the artists I'm drawn to speak to either repetition, what it is to closely pay attention to something, and actually sort of like surrender yourself to it. A lot of their work is sparse in one way or another, I suppose. I hesitate to say like minimalist in a straightforward sense because, if we're being strict about it, like minimalism doesn't really allow for metaphor, right? Like I heard Ronnie Horn talk about this on an occasion, where like, for example, in Ronnie Horn's work, she's concerned with bringing metaphor into it, despite the fact that it's so formally reductive. And I'm super interested in that. If I can sort of winnow things down or sort of like reduce things to a very like fine, to something very fine and something very minimal, but without sort of doing away with content, without doing away with like metaphor or like emotional substance. It's like, I guess there are a lot of artists that sort of take almost minimalism as a template or a starting point and both cast it aside and use it as useful. I think that's maybe one thing. Yeah. Like Jem Southam's studies of rock falls and how they, simply how they disintegrate over time. I think there's something like, there's something extremely moving in that for me, even whether it's like seeing the images and how sort of, how overpowering the prints are in real life if you see one of his large prints, or if it's the fact of trying to imagine this man like going to the same spot once a year, walking with his large format camera and photographing the same pile of rocks, and simply how time affects them. Or like Agnes Martin generally, and she's a fascinating figure, and her life is so complicated. As all of our lives are complicated, but hers just sort of like, there's so many contradictions, and she feels so many strange, like American artistic, like stereotypes about the artist, where like, she lived in New York and then moved to like New Mexico or whatever for years and like built her own house and would do nothing but like build fires for herself and make tea and make paintings. It's that I just think there's something unbelievably beautiful about it. Like,
yeah.
And this is actually
life goal.
Not to go too long. Yeah, actually. Also, I don't know for sure Miss Martin was making tea, but I imagine her doing that.
You just imagine it. Yeah. That's awesome.
There's something about the fact of maybe I'm also sort of like taking a liberty with this, but I think they all sort of address the aesthetic, like with a capital A, or beauty, but in a way where beauty is not relegated to some sort of like Kantian box where you stand at a distance and just admire it, but it's something that really comes out to you, or it asks you to really like look at it very carefully. And it's not, the original, or rather, no, maybe not the original, but Kant's definition of the aesthetic being something that's sort of at a distance or disinterested. And I feel like all of these artists' work, they're definitely within that realm, but I think they sort of push against it in a way, even if it's just in the sense of having to really invest your attention and noticing. It's not like you come away with like a message, particularly insofar as you maybe discover something new about perception. And I think that's really cool.
You seem to have a very philosophical take on a lot of things, and I'm quite taken by it. You had said something, and I keep referencing this interview because I keeps pointing back to some things, and you said, and I might butcher this, but I'm kind of curious if you've thought about this anymore since you said it, was this thing that happens when you focus, this extended focus, and how it changes your perception of time. And you bring up time a lot. You've brought up focus a lot. I'm kind of curious what you mean by that. What are you trying to say right there?
It's a good question. I mean, I think about
quite
it.
A philosopher.
I think it's sort
of I'm like, go on.
I don't know. I think about sustained attention quite a lot, and just like as you said, I don't think you butchered it at all. The way that it both affects you, the perceiver, and the thing being perceived, and helps to erode the perceived line between subject and object. Like, if you've ever had an experience with, altered consciousness of one state, one thing or another, whether that be maybe with like, I don't know, people talk about this with hallucinogens, with intense experiences of meditation, with even religious mysticism, of these experiences of your world expanding / maybe yourself getting smaller, and all these sort of, I don't want it to sound this sort of like new agey, but it's literally just the fact of what happens when you pay attention to something to a committed degree, and like your relation to it changes. Or, there's a Edmund Husserl, the philosopher, German philosopher. I think he was German. His sort of, he's one of the first people to really sort of spell out phenomenological study, and his concept of bracketing, like what happens when you sort of you choose an object or, a thing, and simply pay attention to it. You don't think about it necessarily, and you sort of observe yourself and what happens. It's so similar to what happens in certain forms of meditation, and it's so similar to what happens generally when an artist is working committedly on something. I think that, I've just been really fascinated about that in like my own experience with the world. I think that my experiences with it have sort of helped to steer the way I go through the world. Not just in terms of making art, but in terms of the rest of my life. Ideally, the border between those things isn't so distinct. But I mean, it's. I suppose I could go into it in a more personal, less sort of like theoretical sense. But it's like, I also have a hard time sort of making a division between the theoretical aspect of it and like the personal, emotional aspect of it. Also maybe a cliche, don't really care, but I find the idea that, for example, to be in a committed relationship with someone, like romantically, a family member, a friend, whatever, one way to sustain that is to realize that the more that you know someone, not the more you know them, the less you know them, but you'll never know them exhaustively, and to sort of surrender to that, and to use every instance of being with them to learn more about them, and to sort of like give them space to change, and not sort of like let your imago or your idea of them like overtake them. I think that's obviously a beautiful and important idea, and I'm curious if I can use photography to apply that to like inanimate things, or things that we consider inanimate because we don't pay enough attention to them. I think that the more we pay attention to small things, the more we see that the world is complicated, that what we typically consider inanimate actually has a sort of life of its own, and that if we give it our attention, we'll sort of garner more respect for things like I could say nature with a capital N, but individual things in nature, small objects, whether that's like a puddle or the quality of light at dusk, and how every night, it has its own sort of characteristic. It's never the same each time. I'm curious if I can use photography to sort of like apply that to the world.
Do you think that's what you're doing now? Do you think that's what's happening now? Yeah, because I noticed in some of the first images on your homepage, the titles are the amount of time.
Yes,
and so it almost seems like you're pointing to something there. And when I read that in the article, I was like, maybe this has got a connection.
It definitely does. I mean, part of it is
okay.
I don't know. I find the way that I photograph really important for understanding the photographs. I'm by listing the times next to the pictures, I'm both sort of trying to show that without being too didactic, and explain like, oh, I'm making long exposures, and this is what happens in a long exposure, and all these things. Like, I don't want the meaning of the work to be limited to some like boring photographic technical thing, but at the same time, like, if I'm taking a 10-minute or an 8-minute or a 6-minute exposure of something tiny that doesn't really look like it's changing, and if I spend 6 minutes while the picture's being made just like watching it and how it changes, or even if I'm walking away from it and then coming back when the exposure's over, it's almost like the camera has seen something that I didn't. And I also find that to be fascinating. This I guess another extra layer is I've definitely become interested in how the camera works other than our eyes. Like photography is so useful for making things that look like seeing, but I'm also interested if I can use it to make things that sort of push against that. It's not that they don't look like seeing, it's that maybe they're at the threshold of that, things disappearing or things being kind of illegible. I think the period of time that I took the pictures is like extremely significant for the meaning. And I don't know. I photograph, or at least I try to photograph with some regularity, right? So like, I don't know, there's almost like a serialistic sort of thing going on. And so I think that the time becomes relevant for sort of, for indexing that.
Sure. It's kind of got a double meaning there for you. It's fascinating. And so it's, I think this is a great opportunity to go ahead and kind of jump into some of your work, and we can start taking a look. I know you've put them in chronological order, so you're going to kind of take us back and work us to what we just talked about. So we gave a lot of our listeners a really nice tease for what's coming. So all right. So let's go ahead and take a look.
So this is an example of some of the work that I was making just post-college when I moved to the Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Body of work called Eyes Make the Horizon. It's sort of the example of when I was working, trying to sort of say something explicit about how, we understand nature as something separate from us, but really, it's not. The borders of self and place are porous and blurred. And when we talk about landscape, I'm aware that it sort of has this to say it bluntly, it has a pretty colonial history in terms of how landscape and even how linear perspective and what we consider realism in landscape has been conceptualized. And so I was trying to make landscape pictures that didn't have a horizon, where there was no vanishing point, and sort of like find small ways to push back against the typical devices of landscape photography. This is an image from like an install of the show when I suppose it was like my first solo show in Marquette, Michigan at the LSAA Gallery. And I remember it pretty fondly. And all the prints were, it's a pretty big wall. I don't have the dimensions, but each print is 36 inches and 40 inches with the border. And so, it's a room sort of like lined with these fairly large images, with the goal of the viewer sort of being able to enter them if they sort of, if they come at it in the right sort of mental or emotional space. Jumping, I guess, kind of far ahead to some of the work that I made in grad school. I took I took some years to sort of figure out what I was doing. I was continuously making work between 2017 and 2020. I made a lot of work in 2020 and 2019, but they were odd years, and COVID was a hell of a thing. So jumping sort of to 20, I have images from 2020, but these are from 2021. And these are sort of the period of time when I started to work more overtly with, subtraction as a working methodology. Like, how much could I sort of winnow things down and subtract? And how far or how close can I get to the threshold of like what is actually like legible in the frame? So like, these are images of a snow-covered hill that I photographed for sort of like 3 months consecutively in the winter in upstate New York. They're all at dusk, and so they're all long exposures. I don't think in the titles here I have the full periods of time. I think perhaps this one I was just on that I do. Yeah, so this is or the time is actually wrong there. Darn, maybe we can edit that out. But I mean, I'm essentially trying to see if I can use long exposure to like erase things, right? To see if I can get to sort of like this single line on the horizon to completely obscure the relationship between myself and the scale of my settings. Like, I didn't want a sense of scale or space to be legible. I wanted it to be kind of the case that if you're looking at one of these prints, which are, I actually haven't exhibited these yet. I'll be exhibiting them in January in Brattleboro, Vermont, which is sort of exciting. But, they're larger prints, and the viewer gets the chance to sort of to enter them, but at the same time sort of bounce back because there's no actual entry point. You can't imagine yourself standing in this space. And so they were sort of a way for me to try to conceive landscape in this way where, it's almost like a view from nowhere in a way. Not denoting objectivity necessarily, but sort of denoting the erasure of a single viewpoint. These are from, I show these together in the same body of work because they're extremely similar methodology. I made them consecutively, and I made them as like a sort of call and response to each other. But these are also from a series called Dusk Studies. The previous ones of the Hill are from the same series. But they're color field images that I was making in upstate New York. I would go to the tops of hills at night or not necessarily at night, but like the very end of dusk, and make these pictures. Once again, these like long exposures, showing the sort of progression of light at the very end of day. So it's like photographing the light as it's in the process of dying, and trying to completely obscure the relationship between, if the shapes are concave or convex, if it's a completely flat plane, or if there's a sense of depth to it, where the illumination is coming from. I wanted to make a picture that's actually indexing something. So like, the light at the end of dusk. But at the same time, I suppose pushes back on how photography is often understood to be able to so cleanly index things. right? Like these show the light at the end of dusk, but you need so much context to know that, as you would with any sort of indexicalization of that, right? I didn't want there to be a sense of like, you know, if there was a sense of space, if there were tree branches, if there were the ground, if there were any of like the content of the rest of my world when I was making the pictures, they would more easily become about that content. And I just wanted them to become about like, you know, whatever relationships were happening between the light and the surface that it was reflecting off of.
Hey, it's still a record. It's still a record too. It's just a different style and a different way of thinking about it. It's interesting. Yeah.
These are from my thesis work from graduate school. They are of a river mouth on Lake Superior. So through grad school, I had been returning to Michigan in the summers to work as like a trail guide in this fairly remote part of the state. And for reasons I won't go into, it's a very difficult place to get to. And so I sort of took that as an opportunity to photograph changes in this site on the shore, this river mouth, and to further sort of talk about, I think I was alluding to this earlier, but taking sort of like an understanding of anti-essentialism, right, that we usually apply to human beings, and applying it to something that we consider inanimate, or applying it to a place. There's also this concept from Theodor Adorno of identity thinking, where our conception of the thing sort of overpowers the actual particular thing. And I was trying to use that to sort of photograph this landform. And
what do you mean by anti-essentialism?
Seeing things and encountering them as like particulars instead of understanding them as having a sort of like, as having like an essence. So for example, with the river mouth, I wanted to really show that that any given documentation of the river mouth will not be exhausted. Like you can't exhaust it is a thing. It's constantly changing.
Yeah.
It doesn't have a sort of form or an ideal form that it returns to. It's like, it's the space between the lake and the river. It's like, it's an in-between space. It is, it's constantly changing. It's a way to talk about change, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I started making these photographs, and I can read them aloud if you like. I don't really.
Of course, please.
But these writings to sort of like go along with the pictures, and the relationship's not really one-to-one, but they more so have to do with, I guess, the subject matter I was trying to get to by photographing. So this one reads, Narcissus drowned in a pool that became a mirror. He fell in love with his reflection in the pool and felt toward it, attempting to meet it. Had Narcissus gazed at his reflection in a river, he would have seen a silhouette cut through by the current, his features illegible in the unsettled surface. He might not then have fallen into the water and drowned. He might have lived had he not known his own face, the pool, a body of water in the shape of an ego. So it's like, a way to talk about self in this case, and the extension of, for in this case, narcissism, or like the idea of like a solid sense of self, and trying to use the river to sort of push back against this, or to sort of explore change, or like non-essentialism, always thinking of yourself as particular and changing. I can give this one a read too. But
please. We have time.
Okay. Wolf walked into the river ooze with stones in her pockets. Full pockets. River stones dense in their beauty and smoothness. I wonder if she felt the stones in her hands, felt both surfaces speak to one another, skin touched and stone held. I wonder if this gave her pause on the shore, held her attention. I imagine her, enveloped in the act of holding a stone, living a moment longer. This is beautiful, but beauty alone will not save anyone. It is without an ethics. It must be swallowed whole. This is about attention. Hold the smooth, dark stone tight in your fist until it softens from pressure and heat. It was formed this way in the first place. Acts of attention soften our felt edges. So, these sort of like bits of, these bits of text that are exploring what I'm thinking about in this more poetic form. And
Yeah.
I hope I have some radiators that just went on in near my office.
Oh, yeah. It's adding atmosphere. No, I'm just kidding. That is, are you writing these?
I am. Yeah.
Yeah. And so these are kind of reflections. And what's that?
I was just saying I've been working with text sort of without. I guess I'm trying to figure out how text plays with my work a lot of the time, but yeah. Go on with what you were saying.
Well, I'm kind of curious. Is like, are you when you're making these and you're making work and stuff like that? Are you writing in conjunction? Are you also very much involved in journaling and writing?
Yeah, I am. A lot of the time, so things like this. I think the first one was written shortly after the picture was taken. The second one was written sort of retrospectively. A lot of the time, the writing for me ends up being, something that happens when I'm like sort of congealing and putting together some stuff from a more informal journal, sort of like gathering my ideas, or looking at my work as it ends up looking more like a product as opposed to just a process, and then sort of wanting to find an actual like generative way to continue to interact with it besides editing the images, besides sequencing the images, exploring with them as a physical process. I'm still trying to sort of I guess it's a way for me to sort of ask questions of them and to speak with them. Sure. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Or reflect, about them. It's I bring this up a lot in my show. A lot. It's because Steve always talks about images being thinking devices, and they allow us to kind of reflect, think, look back to. Often images encompass ideas, concepts, and so much. And I think writing about it is probably very useful, because in a lot of ways you can look at this image and you don't really have a sense of place. You don't really have you don't have really a foothold of what these are. So they're kind of abstract in some sense, but yet they also seem familiar. Anybody that spends time at dusk or dawn recognizes these colors,
Yeah, I hope.
And so it's, and especially using a photographic process is pretty powerful. And from my perspective, I think the writing adds so much more. Now having talked to you, so much more of a. There's so much more of a thoughtful process that goes into it. So I quite enjoy them. I see you writing a book one day of these prose.
I mean, thank you.
I would
love to. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you with any of your work put it in a book form and maybe made something like
that? I have actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
I self-published a book of, it sounds funny because it's like from undergrad, but of like my undergrad thesis, that it's actually quite precious to me. I never like distributed it in a meaningful way. But I did do it. At one point, I have a small collection of my work from Northern Michigan, Eyes Make the Horizon, published by a little publisher and gallery in Michigan called Subjectively Objective. Like that's a sort of thing that's out there in the world. I am also currently, this is with like the work I'm working on now, but I'm specifically thinking about it's in making the work I'm making now as a book eventually.
Sure.
I'm also writing to go along with the images that I'm making now. I just haven't, it's something I'm very much in the process of, and I'm in a place where I'm trying to figure out how the words live with the images, as, like physically how to actually exhibit them and how to show them. Because when I write, I'm more so interested in the words being seen as something to read versus as like a physical object, like a lot of text art has to do with like turning words, having them pertain in a really conceptually tight way to sort of objecthood. And I'm definitely interested in that, but I'm trying to do that without taking away from the actual content of the words. And I don't know.
Sure.
Maybe they'll work their way into the book at some point. I think that would be
the deep history of that. Yeah, there's a deep history of it. So especially people writing in this way about their work and it being accompanied with images, and so it's it's definitely got some potential. I think they're wonderful. I love your contemplations. I like your philosophical approach and the way you think about things. You're very deep, and I appreciate that.
Thank you. Of course, I'm glad it's me. Yeah.
We could see more for sure. You could continue if you've got more.
I do. Just briefly one more from that series, and some images of the installation. This is an installation that I did in Berlin when I did a residency there in 2022. Making this is also this was another way for me to start thinking about time and space together. So not to belabor this work so much, the body of work is called Concrete. I was in Berlin for a residency for 3 months, and I photographed in this old Stasi building in the stairwells for 3 months, and I would photograph at dawn and at dusk at the very end of day. And so I haven't really ended up investing very much in the work, but I've learned a lot from doing it, namely a lot about how a place that's essentially an empty, it's negative space. It's these stairwells that are mostly air and just empty concrete walls. They hold so much content if you simply watch and wait for them to change. And it was it was a beautiful process, and I learned a lot about my practice from it. These are the body of work that you'd probably know best, Precarity and Shore, from which was the winner of the Urbanautica 22 award. They were also made during a residency that actually directly followed the residency in Berlin, so it was quite jarring, just in terms of the change of surroundings. But I guess I sort of took what I had learned from working in Berlin and was able to immediately apply it in a setting that had felt more urgent to me and relevant. Namely, that I was now in this place that was so dramatically affected by the tide, and that was so fragile and precarious. It's a long peninsula. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't remember how many miles long it is north to south, but it's 2 miles wide, and it is at extreme risk of being, disappearing due to climate change because of sea level rise. And the tides are so dramatic in the bay. It's Willapa Bay, and I was just so infatuated with how dramatic the tides were. And in watching the tides, I found that I couldn't think about them or watch them or look at them in any simply immediate way. I ended up thinking about the future of the peninsula, climate change, and the reality of sea level rise that is hurtling toward us. And so I ended up sequencing the images and editing the images down in this way where the progression of images would speak to a flood, where without sort of spelling it out in a way that would completely overpower the particularities of what I was photographing. So the tide, the details of the place where I was, I didn't want to just subsume those under the topic of climate change. I wanted those to be intact, but I also wanted to show that in seeing something as beautiful as this or as subtle as this, or as, constant in the sense that it's a cycle, it really does read, at least to me in 2022, as pertaining to a possible future. And sort of, I ended up making images that I think spoke to the sense of anxiety that evoked in me. And I think it's a lot to talk about, obviously, because climate change is such a huge, also almost unsayable it clearly needs to be sayable. We're trying to find ways to say it and to represent it. But to talk about our relationship to place. And it was also tricky because I'm used to photographing places that I know very well, and I'm used to spending a lot of time there. And so, I had this opportunity in this place for exactly a month. And, it's a question for me of like, how do I use that wisely? How do I say something about the place that's not just like some like novel thing that I'm interested in to do with like the beauty of the place? But, how do I do that without sort of trying to make a declarative statement about a place that I don't, that I don't know very well? A month there to me is not enough for me to speak definitively about what it's like to be in that place or to live in that place. And I think I can say that, climate change is not something specific to this place. Obviously, sea level rise will be an issue, but it is something that we're all going to be dealing with very shortly.
Well, it sounds like the shortness of time was tough for you. Do you feel like you were successful in giving the proper care that you like to give to a place?
I hope so. Yeah. I hope so.
Well, it won an award, so.
I guess that does say something in this case. Yeah.
But but it's different how you feel. No? So like, yeah.
I think in the end, it's about, it's if the viewer feels that from the images, and I don't know. I wanted to avoid photographing people or like sort of like indexing particularities of the community, because that's not what I was focusing on. It's not really what I focus on with my work anyway. So anyway, yes, I wanted to take an approach to the place where I was using it as a sort of like, the tide was metonymous with sea level rise. They were like one and the same for me in that moment, at least imaginatively. And so I wanted to end the series with this image, which is obviously the sparsest image in the bunch. But I'm hoping for it as a sort of like signifier of, sea level rise, straightforwardly. And also, a sort of way into the work as a sort of contemplative, an opportunity to be contemplative about the topic, right? And I guess this image is also a good like sort of transition into what I'm making now, based on the sort of sparseness of it. Or since I've moved to Vermont, I started making these images that are that index light at the end of day, like the very last light of each day, very similar to like the Dusk studies pictures that I showed earlier. And I wanted to see if I could do that by, like erasing sort of or winnowing down as much of the world as I could for the images, but without sort of sacrificing there being like something there, right? I didn't want it to just be like a straight field of color. I wanted there to be an object because of the way that, I suppose largely because of the way that works with attention and the way that you're able to sort of invest your attention in this one particular spot or object in the image, and to talk about continual change and to talk about a lot of the things that I've been working on with my other work. But, an opportunity to talk about time as a subject in and of itself, and to see if I can straddle the line between sort of specificity and abstraction, right? Like, I can't help but understand abstraction as being, something that's, it's completely not representational, right? And there's an actual object in these images, and it's probably not true for every viewer, but at least for the sake of my process, I understand them as, moving toward abstraction without really fully being there, because there's still a picture of something in the world. And I suppose I'm trying to find ways to talk about what time feels like and the way that sustained attention changes what time feels like. And also as a way for me to use photography as a sort of like everyday, almost like systematic process of, it's like a novel way to measure something in my surroundings, yes, but it's also a sort of way to I don't know, to show enchantment or respect for them, for lack of a better word. It's like, I'm wondering how much I can do out of one tiny thing.
Yeah. Would you be willing to talk about your process in these for a little bit? Or is that top secret? Yeah. Talk to me about how you make these. Yeah.
I try not to forefront it because it just like, it ends up sort of taking over. But, they're images of a piece of glass on a white piece of paper. They're made in the field outside of my house where I live in Vermont. And I essentially, sometimes in the morning, obviously you could see that this is from 6:48 to 6:49 a.m. But most of them are from dusk. And so at dusk, they're mostly longer exposures because, I just have more leeway in terms of the light and how dark it gets so fast. But they're a piece of glass on a white background, and the color that you see in the images is like ambient color. So I'm taking the images on daylight white balance because that's what looks the most like what I see when I take them. And so I sort of like leave them there and end up making these pictures at sort of the moment between day and night, whether that's in the morning or the evening, when the relationship of the object I'm photographing to its background, so like the glass and the paper, where there's a moment where it sort of disappears or begins to disappear, or it's so dark that I cease to be able to tell the difference between the paper and the glass. And in photographing them and making long exposures, the camera is sort of like undisappearing them, like it's bringing them back. I'm like overexposing them by like a stop so that it's not so incredibly dark. And I feel like I'm using the camera, using long exposure, using really low light as a way to, I suppose as a way to play with and manipulate light in my surroundings without ever like touching anything. It's like I'm seeing the way that the camera can actually change the world in ways that aren't quite available to like our eyes, right? So like I'm not editing these images heavily. I'm like, I'm doing like a little bit of like color correction, sharpening, everything that goes into processing an image. But by and large, they're just like what happens when I make a long exposure at this like particular time of day, like this, when there's this particular relationship between an object and its background where it starts to disappear. I'm like just extremely interested in trying to index disappearance and how that disappearance happens differently every single time I take the picture. It's also like this fascinating process of I'm essentially trying to take the same picture over and over and necessarily failing every time because it's not going to be the same no matter how hard I try. And so it's, I'm like trying to work with and against something because I know I'll get pushback like from the world. Like the world will not let me take the same picture every single time. And
this is life.
Yeah. It's a really good.
Yeah. What got you into this idea? What drove you to this approach? Was honestly, it just you had this question and you were like, how did you land on that?
Trial and error is one of the ways. Another is that it's the sense, I think a lot of people can probably relate to this, of like, I really wanted to see what something looks like, and I had to make it to see what it would look like and what would happen. Like, it was like, it's the feeling of just like, I wonder what would happen if I did this. And I feel like I need to, and so I'm going to do it. It's that, a lot of the artists that I've been like inspired by in recent years, also, I developed a greater want to sort of to interact with their work, to be in conversation with their work, along the lines of, repetition. What happens when you make extremely sparse pictures of the world? What happens when you, as Agnes Martin would say, turn your back to the world as a way to sort of say something really like fundamental about it? I don't actually feel like I'm turning my back to the world. I am going out into the world to make these pictures, but I want to to make something that looks, I don't know. It's hard to have a word for it. Something. It's almost like doing metaphysics with photography, I suppose. I know that sounds really pretentious, but like, I think say something about time and about how, once again, what's the old Heraclitus quote? You can't step in the same river twice. A lot of it, I think, really does come down to that for me.
It's a very interesting progression, and I love the experimentation. I just love these colors. I love this color. So it's something I'm really enjoying. Is this the end of what you have for us?
It is actually, yeah. So this is this is what I'm working on now.
Oh, what is it about? I've noticed you take a lot of photographs at dawn and dusk. What is it about that time that's so important to you?
I ask myself that quite a lot, actually. It's almost like I'm continually fabricating reasons for why. I think one reason is that I think they're just incredibly beautiful times of day, like the way that, if the sky is clear, if there's a bit of sun, the way that colors reflect, the way that the light is so unbelievably soft, the way that objects glow or can glow in the right light, and how if I work with them in the right way, it can speak to something about, it's almost like, something is like literally and conceptually thin as like a piece of glass ends up looking like it has this like integrity of its own. It's like this like self, it's like it has this sort of like integrity, like visually, that it doesn't if you just take a picture of it during the day. It has it looks like it's glowing from the inside. And I think that's really beautiful. It's also, I suppose, if I'm thinking about it like historically, it's also a habit I guess I've not been able to kick. I've tried to make some work just like during the day, and it never ends up sticking. But
you're like, man,
even like when I was a teenager, when I was in high school, I photographed mostly. I would go out and do long exposures, and I was fascinated by like the pink sky in Detroit at night when it was overcast, and the way that the light pollution would affect color. And I've sort of kept up that habit since. It also just seems apropos of the fact that in my images, I don't want many of them to appear very peopled, right? Like, a lot of them seem a little sparse or incredibly quiet. And, as far as times of day go, those times of day are that, right? If you get up at dawn and you go out into the woods or a field to photograph, there's a sense of, save the birds or whoever else is out. There's a sense of like this like weird, almost contradictory sense of like extreme stillness and like really rapid change with like the light changing and like the day approaching. I don't know. I don't have a tight way to talk about it except for just sort of like aesthetic reasons or reasons that, I don't know, it's photographing in the morning is really life affirming to me, and photographing at dusk just like works because of the way that the how quickly things change, I suppose.
Oh yeah.
It's like,
well, and it's, you talk about reflecting on time, and it's one of the few times of day that you really get a sense of that. Watching that sun just dip like that and you can just watch it move. It's quite breathtaking, and I really like the morning, and I love getting up in the morning and watching the sunrise and watching the sky change above me as I'm walking in the darkness. Sometimes, it's a really interesting. Sometimes that no photo is captured, but it's something else, and so I was curious what your connection to it was. I often find myself doing the same thing. So it's very cool.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
Thank you.
I was going to ask you this. We are, part of what inspired the show was trying to make sense of the amount of images we find ourselves surrounded with. And we are just constantly being inundated with them. And I was kind of curious, is the way you choose to do your images, you're using long exposures, you're blurring things, you're not doing a pure representation. why do you think you're doing that? Do you think that's kind of a response to the world, or is it just the way you find yourself using a camera? I'm kind of curious why you go that direction so often.
I guess, thank you for the question. It's a good question. I guess it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
It's definitely the way I'm responding to the world. There's something to go back to this again, because I guess maybe it was more formative than I give it credit for. I would spend so much time as like a high school student and a college student in Detroit photographing at night around the city. And it seemed like, I can go out and use the camera to photograph the world and to show things the way that people already know that they are, for the most part. The camera can be used to sort of unearth social realities, personal realities, whatever it may be, that people don't notice or see in broad daylight, right? But I started becoming really interested in, negative spaces, empty streets, surfaces, the way that light reflects and bounces and moves, and how the camera, by making a long exposure, how it can show those things in a way that our eyes can't, and it ends up becoming just fascinating to end an exposure and then to wait and to say, like, legitimately, I don't know what it's going to look like, and I think that's really, I think it's a continually, like, a beautiful process that happens. I think it's like a way for me to partially stay, to have sort of an intact sense of enchantment with the world and use photography for that. It's like, I legitimately don't know what this picture will look like after it's done being made, but it's all part of the process. And I guess the second part of the question, I do also think it's partially a part of the fact that we're so inundated with pictures. I wouldn't say that it's intentional on my part. I would say that if it's anything, it's like just incidental. I do feel oversaturated with them. I think as many of us do. And I also feel that way about information generally, not just images. And so, my practice is partially a way for me to sort of interact with the world in a really tight-knit way, while also thinning things out a little bit. So I guess it does have to do with the proliferation of images, and our image oversaturated culture, but probably not intentionally. Yeah, it's the water we're all swimming in right now.
Yeah, it's so true. I'm also curious about. I've been asking this. I found myself asking this question a lot ever since I've. This next question, it came up in an interview, and I think it's just a wonderful question. And some people say a camera is a mirror or it is a window. And I'm kind of curious in this sense, are you looking for something? Or are you, and when you see your images, do you see something reflecting back to you, or are you seeing a perspective? I'm curious what your thought is on that.
I think I get your question. Yeah. I think the answer is yes. It's hard to say what. I don't want the answer to be a cop-out. I do feel like it's one of those things that it's like I either have to, it's either ineffable or I have to psychoanalyze myself in a hardcore way.
That's what this show's about, if you haven't noticed.
I'm just kidding. Yeah, it's good thing we're here then. I don't know. Thinking about some of the artists that have really influenced me, the way that I work, all of these things. I did grow up Catholic, went to Catholic school from the youngest age up until the end of high school. I'm not a practicing Catholic or anything like that, but I do think that the aesthetics of Catholicism, or at least the sense of having a sort of ritual setting to return to, or in the sense of a sacred space like a church. I don't think it has to be a church. In fact, I prefer if it's not a church. But there's something about the fact of trying to enter a space, being quiet and just sort of existing, I suppose, that growing up religious sort of opened up to me. And I think I'm as the case is with many people who grow up religious, there's sort of like a void in your life when you stop believing. And it's like sort of a way to continue to, I don't know, see like sacredness in the world. I hate to use that term because I think to some degree, like, I don't think sacredness is something that we are separate from, or that is something that you have to search for in the world or anything like that. But I do think a lot of it like comes from my religious upbringing, and B, wanting to sort of have something that's like my own practice that sort of, I don't know, that grants meaning in a similar way to the way that religion works for some people, if that makes sense. That's like, it's kind of a I don't know if it's a stretch. It's one way to answer the question, I suppose. I guess another way to answer it is that I have had really emotional experiences with pieces of art that ask me to focus on one thing for a long time. Like, I don't know, the Steve Reich piece, Music for 18 Musicians, just like this like 40-minute like minimalist piece, where you're essentially taking small phrases and watching them change over time. And the fact that, I don't know, if you're listening to one thing for 5 minutes and there's sort of a small change, and the small change just works in this way where all of a sudden it's like the floodgates open and there's like, I don't know, there's something extremely moving about it to me. And that might be the case that sort of art just like grants me an opportunity to spend time with and to find meaning in something that seems minuscule or that I wouldn't notice otherwise, or that would be boring. I think maybe boring is also a pretty important word there. And then the fact of finding it beautiful becomes like just like this, I don't know, this intense emotional fact. And I think my practice and like as a process, as well as like the images that result from it, I think are trying to sort of to speak to that and to interact with that. I hope that answers your question.
No, it is. And it's a tough question. And it's one of the reasons I keep asking it. It's because it seems like it's both for everybody, you know? Mm-hmm. And it's like you're looking for the sacred, but you're also evolving and finding yourself in these things too. And you're asking yourself questions and finding the answers in this practice. It's mm-hmm. There's something about an artistic practice that does that, whether you're using a camera or a paintbrush. It's just, there's something about this ritualistic thing that you go out and you go and do, and that can provide a lot of insights, not only for yourself, but also it can, it just has some kind of an effect. And I was just curious. You were quite thoughtful in your work and your process, and so thought you might have a little piece of that for me. My next question is I only have a few left, I noticed that not only are you're writing and you're journaling and stuff, but you're also reading. Is there any books out there that are influential for you that maybe our listeners might recommend, or that you have found that are influential for you?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot. I think maybe the writer in recent years that's been actually pretty like monumentally, like it's had a pretty monumental impact on me is Anne Carson. I would definitely recommend reading like any Anne Carson, but the book Decreation in particular is something that really shook me. And I don't know, I won't try to like describe
Decreation.
Decreation. It's partially about, I can't remember her name off the top of my head, this French mystic in the Middle Ages. It's her and Simone Weil, the French political revolutionary and sort of like mystic, who Anne Carson sort of takes as a model to talk about what it is to try to engage in a practice where like you're sort of, I don't know, decreating yourself is Simone Weil's sort of like way to say it, where through attention you are, like thinning the perceptual line between yourself and the rest of the world, or rather maybe seeing that it was never there to begin with.
Never there to begin with. Yeah.
I think her work is amazing. There's like, oh God, why can't I remember the full title off the top of my head? This other Anne Carson poem that always really, really gets me. But the sort of subtitle of it is like it's a piece that's like dedicated to John Cage. And she repeats the word shade over and over in this way that, each day unexpected salvation, and then in parentheses it's for John Cage. I think that poem is also it's just a single poem, but I love it a lot. And I don't know, there's like some other more like philosophically oriented, or like I shouldn't say more philosophically oriented, like academic, sorry to say, like type stuff. Like Jane Bennett's book Vibrant Matter is something that had a pretty big effect on me in recent years. In the book, she's like a political theorist who teaches in Baltimore, and she's sort of trying to conceptualize inanimate things as like she's trying to break down or like do away with or trouble the notion of inanimacy versus animacy. So like, you know, the difference between the bottle cap and myself in terms of like the difference is one of complexity, namely, and that if we start thinking about things that we typically think of as simple, as complex, or as part of large systems of other things, like the border between what is inanimate and what's animate starts to actually break down. That book was really, it's really like trippy for me to read. And there's a lot of sort of like concepts and ways of thinking that I took from it. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of other ones. There's like, I think I have to reread it because it was a hell of a read. But Kaja Silverman's book, The Miracle of Analogy, Volume 1, it's like a rethinking of the history of photography. And I'm probably going to, I guess, like butcher the abstract of the book. But I sort of, the takeaway that I got from it was that like, we don't have to think about photography as this thing that like people invented and it's like this like technological creation, but rather it's something sort of like naturally occurring, like electricity that we learned how to sort of tap into. And, you know, she takes a lot of examples. There's like some very theoretical examples. There's some pretty concrete examples. Like, I don't actually remember if electricity is one that she talks about in the book, but it's what comes to mind for me. She talks about camera obscuras a lot and things like that. And the camera with its own sort of way is like the camera as a viewpoint, right? As opposed to the extension of a human viewpoint, like the camera having its own sort of like subjecthood almost. And I think that book was really cool. And I think I need to reread it because it's kind of dense, but you know, not that that's a reason to be afraid of it, but I think, yeah.
No, I love books like that. The ones you read multiple times. I have poems that I read regularly that just kind of remind me of certain things. And, you know, I think the best books are books that you can read at different parts of your life and you get something out of it differently. Those I think are some of the most, they're already idea packed, but you are also different. You know, you go through these changes and your perspective changes and it broadens or it restricts. It just depends on where you are in part of life. And when you have a good book that you can read like that, I actually read a lot of philosophy stuff. And so there's a certain book that I read constantly. And every time I read it, I find something new. And I was like, that wasn't in there before. Or maybe I just wasn't ready for it. Well, it's Meditations by Marcus Aurelius.
Okay. Yeah,
I read that all the time. I read it all the time. It's something that I've grown up with. And it's my mentor. She gave it to me, and I've just constantly read it. And so it's just some of those books, you know, that in their time they might have been misunderstood or maybe what have you, you know what I mean, or whatever. And they just they continue to unpack truth to you or unpack something for you is really important. And I felt like you had gotten a hold of a few. Because you've gotten a couple of pieces of things that I've thought about, and it was very delightful. So I think that's a great place to kind of get into my final question that I ask everybody, And the final question is, a lot of my audience are visual makers. A lot of them are photographers, and a lot of them are here, listening to artists. And so do you have any advice for someone that is getting themselves into an image making practice, maybe a photography? What would you tell someone that's just kind of making their way now?
It's a good, also hopefully it's not a cop out of an answer to begin with, but I feel like it's so dependent on the person, because some people have so many different priorities with what they want to do with images, or with how, the particular way that they want to sort of structure their life around it, if that's the case. It's
sure.
I feel like the instances where it seems most meaningful, or where people seem to find something significant in doing that, is when they've really found something idiosyncratic, or a way to speak to something particularly extremely and particularly relevant to them. But I don't know, I have, there are definitely some things that I typically tell students, regardless, points to sort of go through, hopefully most students are sort of told that you shouldn't compromise on your vision if you have a vision. I think that that's true. I think it's incredibly important to listen to your peers, to listen to other people that you respect, especially if they agree with you, or if they disagree with you. You might not want to compromise on your vision or whatever, but you should definitely take criticism well. And I guess this is sort of point 2, is that you should seek out criticism, and that you should actually work it into your practice, because art is not a strictly individual effort. It is a communal thing. It's a set of social practices. It's art wouldn't exist if we didn't socially agree that it exists. And so I think being part of a community artistically, and actually incorporating, the critiques of others you respect into your work, or maybe others you don't respect, if they have good points, the things to point out. I think that's incredibly important. Be open to critique. What else? I would say, don't be afraid to put yourself in difficult positions for the sake of your work. Good things can often come from that. Not as a sort of not as a way to sort of say that you should, that suffering is redemptive or anything like that. But, because I'm not trying to say that, but I guess I'm trying to say that getting out of your comfort zone is often a good thing, especially if you have to sort of it could be something as simple as it's the middle of winter, you live in a cold climate, there's pictures that you want to see that you need to go out into the cold to make, and you're really regretting it. You should go do that, and you should do it as much as possible. If it's something as small as that, to something taking a chance and going to someplace new, moving to a place that you might gain further interaction with other artists, with other people that you admire, with galleries or institutions or whatever you're seeking. For me, for example, that was moving to places that I visit, they're where I want to be, less so than moving to places for social or networking reasons or any crap like that. But I, after undergrad, I moved to Northern Michigan, and all of my faculty in undergrad, not all of them, but, there was a sort of a sense of why are you doing this? I was I had a good museum internship that could have turned into a job, and I chose to go and make work instead. And I think that, I don't know where I would be if I had stayed or had taken the museum job, but I don't regret it at all. And I think that, the period where I moved there specifically to make the work ended up being one of the most important parts of my life. And it was a risk that I took, I suppose. I guess another one that just gets back to the previous one that I said is just try to be a part of a community, find other people who care about things that you care about and that are asking similar questions. I don't know, I feel this might sound a little pessimistic or paranoid or something, but I feel a lot of artists, at least in the States, have a tendency to feel threatened if somebody's making something similar to them, if they're asking a similar question in an effective way. And, that's not true. That's not true for everyone, but I think it can be a sort of like an attitude that people can take, because like, there's this idea of like art is this like self actualization, and it's like, it's all you or something like that. But, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage, and you're whatever topic you care about, you are putting that at a disadvantage if you're like centering yourself in terms of trying to answer it. So I just think being a part of a community, whether that be like people who care about something socially similar to you or aesthetically similar or any of that, like I think that's really important. And this is coming from somebody who has a penchant for sort of like for solitude. I think, I've sort of like come to realize that you really do need to like take large periods to sort of like re-immerse yourself in the world and in community. You can't be an island. I don't know.
I think that last bit was really, really nice. It's that thing that it's like you're afraid that, if somebody else is exploring the exact same idea that you have, that in some way that, you've lost your originality or something like that. And I think with your last project, you talked about trying to recreate the same image, but you never can. You know what I mean? Just like even if they tried to make what you were doing, they could never do it exactly the way you're doing it. It's a great connection to, I think, your body of work. And it's so true. You're so right about that. So thank you so much for your time today, Michael. It was a wonderful conversation, very insightful. I love the work. How can people find you if they want to find you? Are you on socials? This is where you can kind of plug what you've got going on.
Yeah, if they really want to find me, they could probably find me like walking in the woods. But I'm on Instagram under just my name, like Michael_Zuhorski. My website is also just my name, Michael Zuhorski. Those are really the best places. Like I'm trying to like pare down some of my Instagram use presently. We'll see how well that goes, but and my email is on my website if you want to get in touch with me. I always love questions and conversations and just like meeting people. Yeah.
That's great.
That's pretty much.
Well, thank you so much for coming today.
Yeah. And thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure.
Of course. And to everyone that's listening out there that have made it this far, thank you so much for joining us today on the Urbanaut. If you love this content, you like this content, please like, share, and also comment. And also join our community. If you want to support this program, join our Patreon at patreon.com and join our community there that helps kind of support programs like this and reaching out to great artists like this. So until next time, we'll see you on the next one.